An old war watch sits in the back of a drawer. The dial is faded. The case is scratched. The strap looks dry, cracked, and tired. Maybe it was found in an estate box, beside a few old photographs, a folded discharge paper, or a letter that no one has read in decades. To most people, it may look like a broken old wristwatch. But to a collector, a plain watch like this can raise a very different question. Is it just an old timepiece, or is it a surviving piece of World War II history? This is the mystery behind the World War II A-11 military watch, one of the simplest and most respected American wartime timepieces still studied by collectors today. It was not made to look expensive. It was not made to impress anyone across a dinner table. It was not designed as jewelry. The A-11 was built for use. A clear dial. A practical case. A dependable movement. A watch meant to help a serviceman know the time when timing could matter deeply. And that is why collectors still hunt for it more than 80 years later. Not because every A-11 has a famous story. Not because every one belonged to a pilot. Not because every example saw combat. Those claims need evidence. Collectors look closer because the right details can turn a quiet old watch into a meaningful historical object. The maker name on the dial, the movement inside the case, the markings on the case back, the condition of the hands, crown, strap, and dial, the papers, photographs, letters, or family records that may have stayed with it. Each of those details can change how the watch is understood. A scratched case may not be damage alone. It may be evidence of use. A faded dial may not make the watch worthless. It may show age, service, and survival. And a simple document found beside it may matter as much as the watch itself. So why does this plain-looking military watch still matter to collectors? How did a functional wartime tool become one of the most recognized American military watches of the Second World War? And what should a family, collector, or history lover look for before cleaning it, repairing it, or separating it from the papers that came with it? To understand why this object still matters, we have to go back to the moment it was made and the world it was made for. In the early 1940s, the United States was not only sending men, aircraft, ships, and equipment into a global war. It was also producing millions of smaller objects that rarely appear in history books. Tools, compasses, field gear, paperwork, maps, and watches. The A-11 belonged to that world. It was not created as a luxury watch. It was not meant to be a status symbol. It was a military specification timepiece built around a practical need: accurate, readable timekeeping for men working under pressure. During World War II, timing was not a minor detail. A pilot needed to know when to reach a checkpoint. A navigator needed time for calculations. A crewman needed coordination. A mechanic or ground crew member needed schedules, orders, and movement to line up correctly. Even away from the cockpit, time mattered. Military life ran on orders, briefings, transport, maintenance, communications, and coordination. A watch could be part of that larger system. It helped turn individual men into a working unit. That is why the A-11 looks the way it does. It was plain because it had to be useful. It was readable because a confusing dial could waste precious seconds. It was compact because it had to be worn, carried, and used. It was functional because wartime equipment had little room for decoration. Collectors often associate the A-11 with American aviation, and that connection is understandable. Watches like this were closely tied to pilots, air crews, navigators, and the broader world of wartime flight. But this point needs care. Not every A-11 belonged to a pilot. Not every A-11 flew on a combat mission. Not every old military-style watch is automatically an issued wartime example. That is why the object itself must be studied carefully. American watchmakers such as Bulova, Elgin, Waltham, and others were part of the wartime production environment. Their names can appear on watches that collectors still examine today, not because the name alone tells the full story, but because it gives the first clue about where the object fits. A simple maker name can open the door. Then comes the dial, the case, the movement, the case back markings, the wear, the paperwork, if any survived. The watch from the drawer is no longer just an old object. It becomes a small piece of wartime manufacturing, military specification, and personal use. It was built to solve a problem. Men needed to know the time. And in war, knowing the time could mean knowing when to move, when to wait, when to report, when to fly, and when to return. But the history of the object is only the first layer. The reason collectors still study it is hidden in the details most people never notice. The smallest mark on an A-11 may be the most important one. A viewer might notice the scratched crystal first. A collector often looks past that. The first detail is the name: Bulova, Elgin, Waltham. A maker name on the dial, or sometimes inside the movement, can help place the watch within the larger world of American wartime production. It does not prove a dramatic story by itself, but it gives the first piece of evidence. The second detail is the case back. On a military watch, the back of the case can matter as much as the face. Markings, engravings, numbers, or contract-related information may suggest how the watch was specified, issued, recorded, or later handled. These markings need to be read carefully and compared with reliable references, because not every old engraving tells a complete story. The third detail is the dial. Collectors often study whether the dial appears original, whether the numbers remain legible, whether the hands match the period, and whether the watch still has the plain, functional appearance expected from a wartime military specification timepiece. A dial that looks too clean may raise questions. A dial that looks heavily aged may raise different questions. Condition matters, but condition alone does not tell the whole truth. The fourth detail is what has changed. Has the crown been replaced? Are the hands correct? Has the case been polished? Was the strap added later? Has the movement been serviced with replacement parts? None of these details automatically destroy historical interest, but they do affect how the watch is understood. A careful collector wants to know what is original, what may have been replaced, and what can be documented. And then there is the detail that may matter most: the paper trail. A watch by itself can be interesting. A watch with a discharge paper, a wartime photograph, a name, a letter home, or a family record becomes something different. That is provenance. Provenance is the history of ownership and context. It does not simply ask, "What is this object?" It asks, "Who carried it? Where did it come from? Why did it survive?" This is where the A-11 becomes more than metal, glass, and gears. Imagine a family opening an old cigar box. Inside is the watch, a cracked leather strap, 2 black and white photographs, and a folded letter from a young serviceman writing home. The watch may not prove he wore it in a cockpit. It may not prove it crossed enemy lines. But the documents can connect the object to a real life. That connection changes the way people look at it. A common misunderstanding is assuming that age alone creates importance. Another is assuming that every military-style watch has the same history. Collectors know better. The smallest mark may be the clue. The paperwork may be the voice. The wear may be the evidence of ordinary use. And that is where history and collecting begin to overlap. This is also where the A-11 becomes especially interesting to collectors today. Not because it is covered in decoration, not because it was made from precious metal, not because every example has a dramatic wartime story. Collectors care because the A-11 represents a very specific kind of American object, a practical tool made for a serious purpose during a serious moment in history. It was designed to be used, not admired. That is why the plainness matters. A clean, simple dial can say something about military thinking. The watch had to be readable. The case had to be practical. The movement had to keep time. The entire object was built around function, not fashion. For collectors, that functional honesty is part of the appeal. But not every old military-looking watch should be treated the same way. One A-11 may have an original dial, correct hands, a period movement, and case-back markings that match known wartime specifications. Another may have a replacement dial, later hands, a polished case, and no documentation at all. Both may be old, both may be interesting, but they are not understood in the same way. Originality matters. Collectors often look closely at whether the watch still retains the parts that define its historical character. The dial, hands, crown, crystal, case, movement, and strap may all raise questions. Some replacement parts may be expected on a watch that lived a long life, but undocumented changes can make the history harder to read. Completeness also matters. A watch by itself can be meaningful, but a watch kept with its box, service papers, photographs, letters, or family notes can tell a fuller story. Documentation can help separate a general historical object from a personal relic. That does not mean paperwork magically proves everything. It should still be examined carefully. Names, dates, photographs, and service records need to make sense together. But when the paper trail is strong, the object becomes harder to dismiss. This is where many beginner mistakes happen. Someone finds an old A-11 in a drawer and immediately wants to make it look new again. They polish the case until the original surface is softened. They replace the crown without noting the change. They swap the strap and throw the old one away. They clean the dial too aggressively. They separate the watch from the envelope, letter, or photograph that came with it. In trying to improve the object, they may damage the story. A military watch does not need to look perfect to be historically interesting. In fact, a watch that looks too perfect can sometimes raise questions. Wear, patina, small scratches, and aging may help show the life of the object. The important thing is not to romanticize damage. The important thing is to understand what the wear may represent before removing it. That is why preservation should come before restoration. Before cleaning, polishing, repairing, or replacing parts, the watch should be researched carefully. Photographs should be taken. Markings should be recorded. Documents should be kept together. Any service work should be handled by someone qualified to work on vintage military watches. This is not a restoration tutorial, and it is not appraisal advice. It is a reminder that historical objects can be changed permanently by careless handling. The same caution applies to value. Comparable A-11 watches may appear in public sales, collector discussions, or museum-related references, but prices can vary widely. Maker, originality, condition, movement, markings, documentation, and provenance all affect how collectors understand an example. Historical importance does not always equal high market value, and a higher market price does not always mean a deeper human story. A clean, undocumented watch may interest one collector. A worn watch with a veteran's photograph and service papers may matter deeply to a family. A watch with replacement parts may still have educational value. A watch with strong provenance may deserve careful preservation, even if it is not rare. That is the right way to think about the A-11. Not as a shortcut to money, not as a guaranteed treasure, but as a small surviving object that asks for careful attention. The case may have a price in a catalog. The movement may have a technical description. The dial may have a maker name. But inside a family archive, the watch can mean something no catalog can measure. Return now to the old watch in the drawer. The faded dial looks different than it did at the beginning. The scratched case no longer seems like simple damage. The worn strap no longer feels like something to throw away without thought. What first looked like an ordinary broken wristwatch may now look like a small historical witness. That is the quiet power of the A-11. It does not need a dramatic design to matter. It does not need gold, decoration, or a famous name engraved on the back. It does not even need a perfect story. Its importance comes from what it was made to do. It was built to tell time during war. For a pilot, a navigator, a mechanic, a ground crew member, or another American serviceman, a watch like this was not a collectible. It was a tool. It was part of the daily rhythm of orders, movement, waiting, work, and uncertainty. Today, collectors study it for different reasons. They look at the maker, They look at the dial. They look at the case back markings. They look at the movement, the wear, the paperwork, and the evidence that survived with it. But beyond those details is something harder to measure. A family may keep an A-11 because it belonged to a father, a grandfather, an uncle, or a young man whose story was never fully written down. A collector may preserve one because it represents American wartime manufacturing, military specification design, and the practical objects that helped ordinary people do difficult work. That is why preservation matters. Not every A-11 is rare. Not every A-11 is valuable in the same way. Not every A-11 carries a known wartime story. But each surviving example deserves careful attention before it is cleaned, polished, repaired, separated from its papers, or dismissed as just an old watch. Because sometimes the most meaningful American relics are not the largest ones. They are not always displayed in museums. They are not always named in books. They may be sitting quietly in a cigar box, an estate drawer, a basement shelf, or a family archive. The A-11 was built to tell time during war. More than 80 years later, it can still help tell history. If forgotten American objects still matter to you, consider subscribing to Forgotten American Relics. Each episode helps preserve the story behind a piece of history before it disappears. Sometimes, history is not found in monuments. Sometimes, it is scratched into a watch, folded into a letter, or resting quietly in a box no one has opened for years.